Shadow of the Erdtree is a phenomenal addition to an already phenomenal game, although one not without its flaws. In this video, I'm going to break down why I believe it's such an exceptional piece of content, probably a 9 out of 10 in my book. Intervening in any Soulsborne conversation can be treacherous, but it seems all the more so given the unexpected divisiveness of this DLC. In the days immediately before launch, Shadow of the Erdtree racked up unprecedented accolades from reviewers, quickly dethroning The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine as the most highly rated DLC of all time. But, as so often happens, a chasm quickly opened up between the reviewing elite and the average player, with the user rating decidedly more ambivalent. Ironically, during the pre-release days, the only major publication to give it a middling review was Eurogamer, who needled the DLC for allegedly being difficult for the sake of being difficult. We all laughed, but it turns out that the author was more prescient than we assumed, at least as far as the conversation goes. Nevertheless, I agree with the initial reviews. I don't think it's too difficult or difficult for the sake of being difficult. I don't think it's too empty or too full of banal or uninspiring loot. In fact, while I understand the perspective of those who do, I generally think the opposite about all of these things. First, I think Shadow of the Erdtree suffered from its hype. Now, personally, I think it lived up to it, but almost by definition, hype is unlive-upable. Hype, especially when leavened by years of waiting and tornadoes of self-reinforcing internet speculation, quickly goes from excitement to the creation of a sort of platonic ideal, a best possible imaginable. Again, when you imagine the best possible thing, it's unlikely the real thing is going to be as good. Furthermore, I think many people forgot what a DLC is. A DLC is a small or modest add-on to a base game, and that's how most DLCs are judged. Blood and Wine back in the day was highly reviewed in part because its size was so exceptional, and it's not nearly as big or full of content as Shadow of the Erdtree. It can't be emphasized enough that this DLC is the size of an entire game. It's absolutely massive. The map, purely at surface glance, looks impressive, but it's all the more extraordinary when you consider how many vertical levels this one-dimensional map conceals. I found the scope of Shadow of the Erdtree absolutely mind-blowing. Relative to previous Souls games, Elden Ring was already distinguished by its unprecedented verticality. I'll never forget the feeling of awe and excitement I got the first time I realized I could jump across that gap in Stormville onto a narrow protrusion on the opposite roof, unlocking a truckload of new space. Shadow of the Erdtree reproduces this feeling innumerable times over. The rolling vistas stretching up, down, and out that you can see at any given point aren't just background scenery. They're actually places you can actually go. Made all the more enticing by the initial impossibility of divining the proper route to do so. Only through further exploration will you find counterintuitive twists and turns that lead you right under or above your head. It's truly genius, a marvel of cartography. The map sections are also distinctive in all the right ways. Visual cues clue you off to this. The stone coffin fissures are richly hued with St. Trina's purple, while Charo's hidden graveyard is aflame with an almost lurid red. Part of this interconnected, intricate map requires exploration, even more so than the base game of Elden Ring. The amount of times I could have sworn I'd cleared an area only to find a cliffside drop-down that led to an entire new zone was mind-boggling. One thing I've heard even fans of the DLC complain about is the paucity of loot and the poverty of the loot that does exist. They point to the abundance of smithing stones and ghost gloveworts, upgrade materials in other words. It's indeed true that there are a lot of these, potentially even too much, but I never found that they came at the expense of items or materials I actually wanted. In most catacombs or dungeons, or even out in the open world, there were plenty of cookbooks, crafting materials, new weapons, ashes of wars, spells, incantations, spirit ashes, and more. I felt like the DLC was as liberal with non-upgrade materials as it was with them, and I was satisfied overall with the density and distribution of loot. Part of this dissatisfaction with the loot per square foot, I think, may be a general distaste for the open world format. Open worlds, by definition, have a more limiting ratio of space to loot than closed world RPGs do. Being free of the strictures of linear, closed-level design comes at the expense of a certain amount of items. You're certainly not required to like this trade-off. Plenty of people don't like open-world games for perfectly legitimate reasons, but I do think you need to judge an open-world game on its own terms. If you don't like open-world games, you can't really be mad at an open-world game for acting like an open-world game. In general, I found the crafting additions to also be really great. I particularly love the giant bombs you can now make, and the random strokes of brilliance like making Golden Vow a consumable were a total delight. Field enemies were also a positive for me in general. There were enough familiar faces to preserve the sense of integration into the base game, but these were at least equally offset by new enemy assets that make the DLC feel like a distinctive, coherent place with an identity of its own that reflects its eons of segregation from the lands between. Some of these new enemies were initially quite annoying, like the Gravebirds, but once you realize how shitty their poise is, you can easily nuke them with things like the Ash of War on Rolana's swords, and it's no problem. One exception to this would be the puzzling decision to lard certain areas of the map with rune bears, among the most obnoxious, overpowered, and generally execrable enemies from the base game. Not a welcome sight. The new weapons were a highlight of the game for me. As a katana scrub, the Great Katana weapon class was an absolute delight. They made it easy to wield a more power-hitting katana without preventing you from easily light rolling. The same is true for the light greatswords. Milady became one of my favorite weapons. In general, I don't love playing with heavy weapons because I prefer swiftness and dexterity over hitting hard but often getting locked into lumbering, protracted attack animations. But Milady plus the impaling thrust Ash of War was the best of both worlds, allowing me to attack swiftly while inflicting massive poise damage. The martial arts weapon class was also totally dynamite, and I'm already actually working on some footage of beating up Hoaraloo with my fists and feet, which is a lot of fun. One area where the DLC really falls flat, though, is with its minor bosses found in dungeons and catacombs and stuff like that. NPC-type fights bulk large among this coterie of distasteful riffraff, and the overwhelming majority were just plain nuisances to fight. I don't personally enjoy playing PvP, so perhaps many people who do might feel differently, but this is my personal review, so there you have it. I don't want to fight myself or someone who fights like me, so I wound up just spamming jump attacks or poise-breaking Ashes of War to get through the fight and tank the damage, the exact opposite of the way I normally approach bosses that are thoughtfully designed. The Remembrance bosses, though, are where this DLC excels. Pound for pound, I found them some of the best bosses in the entire game. These bosses are punishing, brutal, and difficult, but ultimately tameable. They demand attention to technical detail and mechanical dynamism, while still presenting players with a menu of approaches to choose from. I have a whole series on some of my favorite bosses from the DLC, breaking them down in detail, as well as explainers and guides that further discuss them. Mesmer is a visual and technical spectacle, and they executed a very fine line here in a fight that easily could have veered either towards underdelivering or towards devolving into campiness. Instead, it delivered perfectly, mixing challenging but graspable combos, eye-catching signature moves, and a snake fight that is actually as fun, fair, and engaging as the first phase. Rolana takes the best of Pontiff Sullivan from Dark Souls 3 and infuses him with the complexity and increased AI responsiveness of Elden Ring's combat. Both her and Midra offer a range of evasive strategies from traditional dodge rolling to strafing, jumping, and in Midra's case, even crouching. And again, the aesthetics of fire and ice, blue, carrion, magic set up a striking dichotomy that mirrors the shadow versus light themes of the game as a whole. Bale is a fantastic new entry in From Software's rather dubious index of dragon fights. While I love Midir, I think Bale is probably my new favorite dragon. Again, I have a whole video about why I think that, but in brief, his slick but ferocious movements, his impressive library of attacks, the frenzied but fair incorporation of the arena into the fight are all marks in his favor. Unfortunately, some bosses have a few moves that are unfair, but I don't find them to spoil the fight. Meteor's first laser blast seems to be genuinely unavoidable without an Ash of War like Raptors of the Mist, but you'll only encounter it one time, and there's an easy way to deal with it, and it's clearly telegraphed, so it really didn't ruin the fight for me. I really liked the fight overall. Romina's phase transition is actually somewhat worse because it's untelegraphed, and if you're in range, also seems to deal unavoidable damage as you can't escape its radius in time. Again, so this to me is actually worse than Meteor's issue because at least Meteor plainly telegraphs. However, with Romina, you can either get at range or stance break her and get a critical hit around the middle of the fight when you know that this is likely to happen, and then the transition won't envelop you. So again, it really wasn't something that ruined an otherwise banger of a fight because I knew roughly when it would happen and how I could make sure that I could be out of the way of it. But that could be improved in a patch, I think. My single biggest criticism of this game, by far, is indeed about a Remembrance boss, and that's Promised Consort Radahn. Apologies in advance to everybody that I interact with on my channel that I know loves him, but this fight to me is beyond disappointing. It's utterly bewildering. I find myself baffled that it made it out of the studio, and ineffably frustrated that it hasn't been addressed in a patch already. The most tragic part of all of it is that there are good parts of the fight, and it could be excellent with some modifications. It would be so much easier to just dismiss it if the whole thing was trash overall, but it's not. It has potential, and that's what makes it so depressing. As it stands, the core issue is the 3/ combo. This is unavoidable at a neutral stance unless you use something like the deflecting tier, and it's discharged at lightning fast speed. You're therefore incentivized to stick to his left side, dodging left constantly. This grossly constrains player choice and turns the entire affair into a frustrating race to stay in one spot. The second you stray even a little, he's liable to catch you in this undodgeable move. It is completely infuriating. I'm also just in general opposed to reusing a boss for the final boss of a game. If you want to reuse a boss in a new guise at some point in the game, fine, I really don't care about that, that doesn't bother me, but the final boss of the DLC shouldn't be somebody that we've already fought before. Lore-wise, I'm less bothered than some people, but they could have executed it better. I think it's fine that Miquella wants a consort, and it's fine that it's Radahn, but they could have signposted this in the base game more to make it feel less ex nihilo. There's already a foundation they could have used, in fact, and this is me just sort of speculating on what they should have done, so forgive me. But, if they'd made the lore that Miquella had initially wanted it to be Godwyn, but only switched to Radahn after the Rune of Death was stolen, that would have worked pretty well. Because we know from dialogue from a ghost in Castle Sol that this church, which is served Miquella, had been attempting to use solar eclipse rituals to revive Godwyn's soul, but had failed, right? And that seems very much like something that could have tied into what Miquella wanted to do, because he's trying to revive Radahn's soul. In fact, the game goes to great pains to emphasize the death of Godwyn's soul and the perseverance of his moldering body, so the stress they lay on the impossibility of a soul transposition would have worked really well with this ending of having to swap in Radahn as a second choice. Unfortunately, they made my little fantasy impossible as an interpretation in two ways. One, they would have needed an indication in the base game that Miquella was also fond of Radahn in some way. They provide this only in the DLC after you've already killed Radahn in item descriptions. Furthermore, the cutscene flashback you see after the fight has Miquella explicitly ask Radahn to be his consort, so this second choice theory I've cooked up obviously doesn't work. I only mention it because many people believe it should have been Godwyn that we fought, or maybe that FromSoft was going to do that and swapped out Radahn at some point. But to me, it never would have been. It never would have been Godwyn. It's just not possible because Godwyn has a fundamental and final soul death. So I really don't think that was ever in the cards. If they'd made Radahn a second choice alternative to Godwyn, I think the whole thing would have fit with the lore in a much more cohesive way. The Radahn fight leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Many of the moves are extremely cool, and the visuals of the holy damage in the arena could have been quite cinematic, but in its current iteration, it ends up being a pain in the ass that almost reeks of active contempt for the players. It's a shame that this is the conclusion to the DLC, because on the whole, Shadow of the Erdtree is a masterpiece of a game, and it, as well as we, deserve an ending that does it justice.